Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play Joe and Mac on the Super Nintendo in specific. In the last part we started off the game and got a majority of the way through it, honestly. There's only a few stages left at this point. It's just that the final boss is actually kind of lengthy in this one, so we ended up splitting it up into two parts. Every now and then I don't mind doing a game in one 40-minute part, but there's something about that just feels a little hard to recommend to people in some regards in terms of like video length to me nowadays, so like 20 minutes is generally where I like to go for things unless it's RPGs. With that, we're now on to the next level, which is the fire level. The lava in this game is not instant kill from my memory. I say from my memory, because it's actually been about 2 weeks since I recorded the last part. I've actually already done the next two LPs even in this time frame, because I was waiting to see if my brother could get back to me about that book I mentioned last time, the little, like, magazine and all that. He has yet to be able to find it at the time of current recording. If I do this part in bursts, we'll see if he can find it by then. It also might be in our basement, and I might do another burst just to make sure if it's not down there. But ultimately, it doesn't matter. It was a bit of an interesting magazine, but generally, most of the things that I've talked about in games already, probably, that in that book I've already talked about in those LPs, like in Zardion, like in, probably Super Ghouls and Ghosts at this point, honestly. But it's been a while since either of those LPs, so I don't exactly remember. 20 minutes later, it's funny that I said that, because I went to go actually watch the first episode of Zardion to see if I said anything about it. I brought out the magazine there, too. I didn't mention the name, which, unfortunate. So the fire level here ultimately isn't that bad. The biggest annoyance in some regards is actually just the boss itself, but that's not because the boss is hard, it's more it just takes a while. In fact, there are a couple of occasions in this video we end up speeding up the footage, just to kind of keep up a good pace, because there's something about being stuck on one level in a game, at least of this general structure, for too long, that kind of just irks me. For now, though, it's time for the boss. This is the Ankylosaurus. It rolls around a lot in this fight, and while it's doing so, it's completely invincible. You can only hit it when it's kind of just standing on its rear legs. It'll often roll off the screen in some form and then slam down in the middle of the main screen, and from there it'll just sort of bounce around at somewhat random, rolling around until it eventually does the same thing over and over again. Sometimes it bounces low, sometimes it bounces high. Just keep your distance, maybe stay on the opposite extreme from it at any point in time while it's going off screen, because that way you can react accordingly. Otherwise, it's not exactly hard, it just takes a while compared to a lot of the other boss fights. Mind you, the latter half of the game's kind of full of that to begin with. I think part of the tense thing about a long boss fight because of long animations like this really does come down to, especially in older games, the potential loss of time and frustration caused by that when you do lose to something like this. Especially as you die more and more, but you slowly learn the attack pattern, so it's just like, alright, gotta sit through this attack, gotta go over here, sit through this one, go over there, okay, now I can hit you again. It just takes a while, and I'm not usually a fan of boss fights that take forever. So this stage in particular has the final key for a locked door, and it's technically one of the trickier ones to get, mostly because the spacing for you to hit the egg to get the purple pterodactyl out of it instead of a weapon or a random thing is kind of tight. You need to hit it from across the screen right about here. Otherwise, if you go too far right, the next enemy spawns in and it won't work. You could theoretically go for that one up, but I'm not actually certain if you can get that before beating the stage without taking the death to get it. I guess theoretically you might be able to time hatching that purple pterodactyl in such a way where it'll grab you on the way down, but I wouldn't necessarily tempt fate to try that, if it's even possible at all. That is technically the best life for life grinding in the game, but I forget if I show that off or not. Okay, having done a quick cursory glance through my footage, I, in fact, do not show it off. So I believe last time I mentioned that if you beat a stage and re-enter it, you can press start and select to leave it. In fact, that's how I got the stone wheel. I just did that over and over again until I got it. What you do is you enter this stage and you go and get that one up, and then immediately after grabbing it before you fall in the pit, you exit the stage. Then you re-enter, and it's there again. So you can just grab it over and over again, and that's kind of handy, especially if you lose a lot of lives in really stupid ways like I tend to in this stage because those one-tile platforms are really hard to read the exact landing points of. I fall there all the time, at least once. I think the most I've fallen there is like 3 or 4 times in a row. In a way, it's just like, okay, screw it. I'm just gonna use this invincibility and go past everything because it's the only way that's really worth it at that point. For now, though, it's time for the boss of the level, which is a dinosaur skeleton. They had to get at least one joke about fossils in there somewhere. So the way this fight works is that whenever you do a normal point of damage, it completely scatters itself into pieces and it'll bounce around. And the pieces as they fall can still hurt you. So the main way around this is to head to the far left of the screen and then do the somersault jump upwards to use the invincibility frames that gives you to just clip to the one on the far left. They do always fall in the same position, so you can use that to sort of memorize your way around it, but it's just easier to do this. You could also theoretically somersault left or right through them, but that's not as easy to do in my experience. It can also do another behavior whenever you hit it, though, in that its bones will scatter, but the head will stick around and then just dash directly at you. Otherwise, this boss's main attacks are to just wave its head around until it hits you. In fact, there's the second behavior that can have whenever it hits you, right then and there. I think it tends to do that a little more often towards the latter half of its health or so, but ultimately, not a very hard boss. Use the elevated platform to your advantage in order to get around some of its attacks, and you should be fine. With this, though, we're now going to be onto the stages of the game that I just outright consider hard, because even if you bring a lot of lives into them, the bosses either take a while or have a lot of health, or the stages can drain you enough resources along the way there to be a potential problem. Mind you, hard for Joe and Mac 1 on the Super Nintendo specifically still isn't, like, what a lot of people think of when they think of classic hard games. I'd say it's closer to just, like, a mid-stage Mario game kind of deal, if that makes sense at all. But they do have 2 bonus areas you can go to before heading over to the final main level, and you might as well take advantage of this one. This one takes out a dinosaur and acts as a health restorer for doing so. That's why I saved it for now, because this way I can guarantee I'm pretty good on health going into the final main levels. And this one in particular, this final bonus stage, is closer to the other varieties we've seen. It's another meat grabbing section, which, hey, still good for health, but my main goal here is to get the health along the way and then try to get the extra 1-ups before they dissipate. If you're playing along and are getting a little nervous about your life count, especially if you died more than I have, take this moment to go use the previous stage you were just in and do the life grinding trick I talked about until you're at a life count you would be comfortable with. If you're a new player to the game, I would recommend probably about 20 lives, if only because some of the final bosses can definitely do some damage pretty quickly. But if you're used to this type of game, I'd say you're probably safe around 15. Even if you use the first run. I'm personally fine with even the 10 I had beforehand, but it's good to have some extras built up just in case. So this is sort of the final level. It's the final level on the map, but there is something else coming up. In the case you get a game over, they do give you all of the items here just in case, which is nice to have. On top of the fact that enemies around here also drop health pretty regularly. There are quite a few enemies here, so they are trying to drain your health at the same time, but they give such regular pickups, it's not really much to worry about. If anything, the biggest threat's this section right here because of, again, thin platforms in this game don't exactly feel comfortable to jump on or off of in any regard. Also, word to the wise. I forget if I mentioned this last time, but when you die and you can move around as a ghost, you are in full control there, of course. But if you also press the jump button, you leave that state early, and if you do that in wrong places, you can lose 2 lives in a row very quickly, so be a little careful. Thankfully, from memory, I believe that's actually the last bottomless pit in the game. I don't think the actual final stage has any of those to worry about, thankfully. Also, if you're lower on lives, maybe worry about the pterodactyl platforming here, but I just usually decide to say screw it and use the lava invincibility frames to my advantage in a lot of cases. It ultimately does save enough time to be worth it, I would say, especially if you have a surplus of lives from doing life grinding. So now it's time for the boss fight. Does this seem a little familiar? Because it's another really big T-Rex. And just like the earlier T-Rexes, this thing will only take 1 damage from anything you do to it. The boss itself has about the usual attacks. It can dash into you, it can throw some rocks at you, it can throw some cavemen at you, and I think they can also come in from the right. And those cavemen, as usual, can drop health in the case you need it. But the reason I recommend the boomerang is because compared to the other projectiles where you can only have one of them on screen or are too slow, the boomerang will allow you to pile on damage quickly enough that it should still go by faster than it could, I guess is the way to phrase it. Something else to keep in mind is that we fell onto a little valley for this particular fight. But the platform on the far left of the screen is still technically there, so you can jump towards the left and then jump right off of it to get a better shot in if the dinosaur is too high on the screen for you to reach normally. In fact, that's also a good way to dodge some of its attacks as well. Annoying and tedious, yes, but it's not the hardest, especially if the cavemen, Neanderthals rather, cooperate and drop some good health items. Eventually, the fight does end, and you are freed, even if it takes a couple of lives along the way, though. There we go. And with that, we now have access to the proper final stage. The unfortunate thing is, if you have very specific fears, the final stage is inside of this dinosaur. That's disgusting. This stage isn't that long to begin with, as with most of the stages in the game. The biggest thing is that it's got very tight corridors compared to most of the other stages, so Neanderthals rolling all over the place can actually catch you off guard and kind of hit you pretty cheaply in some points in this stage. The best thing to do is to actually take advantage of the stone wheels rolling properties and throw one out ahead of you ahead of time if you're coming over against a little overhang or underhang, just to hit any enemies that are going to try and surprise you along the way. Helps that the stone wheel can also climb some of the hills around here, so you don't need to worry too much about it. Ultimately, just try to preserve your health as best you can for the final boss, though, because that's probably where you're going to have some real trouble in this stage, as to say that the end game of this is a health sink and a damage sponge, even with the previous bosses in mind, is a little bit of an understatement. How you approach this will largely probably depend on the amount of lives you have, though, because if you have a good surplus, you can just take some cheap hits and do just some damage yourself in the meanwhile, going for a Pyrrhic strategy. If you don't have a lot of lives, focus on dodging first. So the final boss within this dinosaur is Satan, I guess? You would think the beating heart on the top right has anything to do with this boss fight. No, it doesn't. Phase 1 of it isn't against the devil itself, though. It's against gray plant heads. These will bounce left and right several times to try and make contact with you. Whenever they hit, I believe, the opposite edge of a screen, they will turn around. Thing to note, though, is that they do fall randomly across the screen at first. You can fight like 4 or 6 of these in a row. And they will only jump the direction they're actively facing. But similarly, when they get hit, they will bounce the opposite direction that they're facing, even if that's into you in some cases. So keep that in mind and try to space out your hits in such a way that keeps you out of harm's way. Notably, the final boss being Satan is a Super Nintendo exclusive thing. The final boss in the original game is actually the heart partnered with a larger Neanderthal, which is also reflected better in the Genesis version, which I will play eventually, just to say, hey, here's what the arcade version's roughly like. Not exactly a one-to-one translation to the Genesis, because you had to make some sacrifices going from arcade hardware to the consoles at the time, but worth noting all the same. So the devil is an HP sponge. Even with the strongest weapon in the game, aka the wheels, it takes upwards of 30 hits to reduce this guy's HP, so you're in this for a long haul. And speaking of a long haul, I should note, if you do get a game over in this final stage inside the dinosaur, you do get sent back to the map and have to replay the previous stage. But the game does technically know you beat this stage. So what you can do in that case, if you get a continue, you have to start the stage over again. I have to use a continue, rather. Collect the weapons cache at the start of the previous stage, and then press start and select to exit the stage. It'll treat you as you beating it, and you'll be thrown back into the dinosaur. So attack-wise, this guy has technically 4 attacks. He can dash in from off-screen to try and stab you with his pitchfork. He can stab the heart to effectively cause a heart attack, which will make rocks fall down from the screen in a couple of places, which you can interrupt him before he continues that too far, because I think he can do it multiple times in a row. But towards the latter half of his health in specific, he'll especially start splitting himself in 2, the main one and a clone. The clone has a shorter health pool, but if you hit them very quickly before the start, you can actually hit them both at once. The other one will notably disguise itself as the opposite player character you're playing as, so watch out for that. In the case you're playing in the 2-player mode where you play at the same time, I actually forget how that works. It probably just does the same thing. You have to figure out which one's the partner or not. So watch out for that. A little annoying that it's got so much health, but it's like the only time the game really puts you to this kind of straits with the amount of HP bosses have, so it's not that bad. Ultimately, even at its hardest again, this is not a very hard Super Nintendo game. If I had played this as a kid, I probably would have a lot of memories of it being hard, but playing it as an adult first, it's not that bad. And that's it. Final boss beaten? Or is it? That was only phase 1. The devil's got a lot more HP to go. In fact, it takes another 30 hits to finish off this particular phase, where he pulls into reverse Char Aznable and ditches the red coloring, and goes for more of a blue. So in this phase, he's a lot more teleport happy. He'll teleport to 6 spaces across the screen, 3 high up in the air, 3 about halfway up the screen, and do one of 3 different attacks. He'll either throw fireballs to the left or right of him, which will then fall down and do nothing. He can send out 3 rings in 2 different patterns from him in the center, and one of them will fire directly downwards, so don't stand directly below him if he starts doing that attack in specific. Or he'll throw a giant fire ring that will move across the room a couple times and do several of them in a row. You can jump over these, but the best way to get through them outside of just, taking the hit and saying, I got enough lives, is to do the somersault dash through it, because you have invincibility frames during that. The boss does have a little too much health for my own good at this point. It is really weird even compared to the earlier bosses, but I honestly find phase 2 to be a little easier than phase 1, because while he teleports randomly, it also means there's a lot of points where you can more easily figure out where he's going to not be, so to speak. Oh, here's an attack I forgot to mention. He can also breathe fire to the left or right of him, which will set either the left or right 2/3 of the floor on fire for a brief moment, so whichever direction he starts doing that in, run the exact opposite way, and you should be fine. Thankfully, while he is a bit of a damage sponge himself, his attacks don't do enough damage to really be a threat in your health bar if you're good about dodging, especially even just 1 or 2 of the attacks. Again, not a very hard fight, just a pretty long one compared to the rest of the game. Something to be on the lookout for, though, is that if he's on the lower portion of the screen, there's a non-zero chance you might just be hitting him with your club rather than whatever you're trying to throw out of your club, be it the boomerangs for some reason, the stone wheel, the torch, or whatever. And that is doing less damage than if you hit him with the projectile you're throwing out of yourself. So maybe try to hit him from a distance if he's lower on the screen, because that way you're doing more damage and not elongating the fight. Yes, that might leave you open to some of his attacks more often than not, but the damage is more often than not worth it, especially if you have a large surplus of lives once again. So with that, something I should talk about is that this game actually has multiple endings, no matter which version you're playing. The Super Nintendo version only has 2 endings. The Genesis and arcade versions have more. And the way it works in those versions, and of course I'll talk about this again once I get to the Genesis version eventually, is when you beat the final boss, there are, I think, 3 or 4 routes to the right out of the screen that vary in altitude. Whichever one you take gives you a different ending visually. It's very minor, it's mostly just jokes. But the Super Nintendo versions is a little different in that there's only one real ending, and then there's a cheat code ending where you press a certain button combination while a very specific credit is on the screen. I edit both endings together into one, but it's worth noting all the same. I'll talk in specific about the code needed for the credits in a few moments, because now we've beaten Satan! Yay! And that's the game. Joe and Mac is harmless fun. It's not exactly deep, but I don't think it really needs to be. It's fun, it's got some okay music, and it's ultimately short as well, because it is technically an arcade beat 'em up. If you got a friend along, it could be nice and fun. But I do think there are deeper versions of this exact experience even on the Super Nintendo outside of this. To my very limited experience, even the sequels are that, so maybe even look into those. If you want to play this version in specific is only on the Super Nintendo, but there's other versions on the Genesis alongside a lot of other consoles, but from looking at, say, the NES version and all that, maybe don't play those. So the cheat code in specific should be activated now. When sound creator Atomic Hanada scrolls on screen, the game checks if you're holding X, A, L, and R. If you are, it gives you the second ending. If you're not, it gives you the main ending. What the endings are which girls are chasing after Joe and Mac. The first 4 are the normal ending. The second 4 here are the second ending. I just edited those together in one fell swoop, just to not have the credits play a second time after this, really. I'm not sure if the next Joe and Mac game I'll do is the sequel or the Genesis version. It really just depends on my whims at that point because of my physical LP list, which I sort of just put things into and then do them in that exact order. But with that, I'm going to need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, have a great night, take care, and I'll see you guys next Let's Play, whatever that might be. See you guys then.